ครับ
I have a question regarding the new discussions. I believe it was on the syllabus, and do we still have it?
I'm sorry.
I believe we have a
The new
new
discussion.
discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was in our conversation in the first, right? That oh yeah, some of you came to me and asked like, it's probably too much of the workload, and so I decided to sort of dismiss it. I think we sort of discussed that in the very first or the second class. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I mean, please feel free to suggest. I mean, it's always good for you to have a look at the news and then try to sort of keep up with what is going on in the world. Yeah, but as I said, I've got a bit of concerns regarding the workload that you really have to do it on a weekly basis, and uh, so that is why I just put it there. Like, yeah, it's good to have, but I won't force you, and I won't count it towards the final marks. And that is one of the reasons why we do this sort of group project instead, right? Yes, please.
อาจารย์คะ if there's no more news sharing, then does that mean the 20% of the score is going to be allocated to the group project instead? Because I understood that the group project was
No,
แบ่ง
no,
คะแนนมาจาก
that is
finals.
that's a separate part. Yeah, this is going to be just purely your participation. Yeah. Because I mean, news is pretty much a part of participation, right? And then I mean, you've come to the classes, and that's pretty much a part of that.
โอเคค่ะ so does that mean finals is 50%?
Right? 20, 30, and 50, right?
โอเคค่ะ understood thank you
Yeah,
ค่ะ
yeah, you're welcome. Because initially it's like 2080 or 20 or 3070, right? That I initially came, and then you said that yeah, is it possible to reduce the weight of the final exam, and then we come up with this final project to sort of um, diversify your risk a little bit, right? Okay, let's do the frontier, right? What just a little bit to recap. I think what we've done so far is pretty much you know why competition matters, right? You know what it means by having this competitive process in place. You understand that there are different tools which lawyers can use in order to make sure that we introduce this competitive process into the economic system. And we have learned some of these tools, right? We have learned why, well, the restriction of competition can be done mainly in two ways, right? The first one is pretty much you do it unilaterally. And in most cases, to be able to exercise that kind of power, you really need to have the power in the market, or in other words, you have to have this sort of significant market power or a dominant player, a dominant market power to begin with, right? And then you use that dominant position because now you're a big one. If the people don't buy from you, they don't have that many other alternatives, right? If you put any conditions, your negotiation power is at the point that they might need to accept your offer on the table. And that is why you can exercise this thing unilaterally. You can tell them that, look, I'm gonna sell you this product. Right? I'm gonna sell you iPad, but you need to buy my iPhone as well, right? You can do that kind of what we call tying, right? Or you can say something along like the line like, I'm gonna sell you my products, but in this condition they're gonna sell you, you have to make sure that, well, you're gonna put the price at this level, otherwise I won't sell you, right? Or that is in other words, it's called resale price maintenance. So there are so many different ways that you are going to be able to exercise your market power unilaterally. And that is something that we learned in the abuse of dominance, right? Which is in the current version of the law is in the section 50. right? 5-0. But we also know that that is a possibility that you probably don't have to be that big of a player, but sometimes you hold this kind of significant negotiation power against your competitors or your trade partners, right? For example, the portion of the transaction that you are having with your trade partner is significant enough to the level that if you put any kind of restriction or conditions on the table, your counterpart will need to accept that, right? We need to accept that, or would find it very difficult to counter offer, or to, I mean, pretty much to steer away to some other trade partners because of, well, as a matter of fact, I mean, having this kind of like significant proportion of transactions means that, well, you have some system in place that accommodate the transaction between, well, your company and that particular trade partner, right? And it's going to be what we call high switching costs in order to switch to the others. And that is why you have to accept some unfair conditions. And that is why we have another provision of law, which is called unfair trade practice, right? So you now see two things, right? The abuse of dominance, which is in section 50, and you see unfair trade practice, which is in section 57. And you can see that most of the time when it comes to abuse of dominance, it means that you have a big player who can exercise something, right? Who can exercise, and this is what we call unilateral. You do it on your own, right? Because either you are big in the case of abuse of dominance, or you probably are not that big, but you are so significant to another trade partners. You might be like a moderate level player in the market, but just because of this situation, or for whatever reason, you have that kind of very significant negotiation power against your trade partner. But this could be either vertical or horizontal, right? And in these two circumstances, if you exercise this power unilaterally, and that sort of compromise the competitive process, that is the power to the Trade Competition Commission of Thailand to intervene and impose both the punishment. Could be fines, could be, well, actually it is, for the abuse of dominance, we know that this is a criminal offense in the current version. So you can now also impose this kind of like criminal charge, including imprisonment in it as well. Okay, but otherwise you can also exercise it in collective manner as well, collective manner, and that is collusion, right? I will just put the word cartels. It's in the section 54 and 55, right? So this is not you alone, but actually the exercise come from the agreement, right? The very act, right? The very act or the very offense comes from the agreement, not your action per se. So it comes from the agreement between two players. Right? The key is on this agreement, and the whole idea is, well, despite the fact that you actually are able to compete against each other, but you decide not to, and you form this kind of agreement to restrain competition, to refrain from competing against each other, and that is what we call collusion. And the distinction between what we call hardcore cartel, which is in the section 54, right, and non-hardcore cartel, which is in the section 55, with certain exception in section 56. The distinction is on the matter that you agree to fix. Right? If you agree to fix on certain market parameter, actually quite precise, right? You agree to fix on, well, on price, on quantity, on area or territory, and in the bidding process, which is sometimes we call bid rigging. These four particular circumstances will be what we call hardcore, right? And it is in section 54. Okay, so that's the big picture of kind of the conduct that, well, could compromise what we call competitive process, right? And most of these are what we call as well in the umbrella term, we call them as ex post, right? In other words, we sort of wait until you've done something wrong, right? We are not punishing someone for being big, right? We are not punishing this one just because they are a dominant player. Right? We are not punishing this one just because they're a dominant player. You can be big, and that is fine because you might be so successful, right? I mean, you've done great business model. You perform outstandingly. You win over pretty much all consumers. Then you become a dominant player. You should not be punished for that. But once you become a dominant player and you exercise your power in a malicious way, then you should be controlled. You should be regulated, right? So it is not just about being big or being influential or being, well, powerful. It is about you abuse that kind of position. And that is why the terms abuse of dominance, the term abusing the abuse of dominance is super important, right? So that is exposed. Like, once you've done thing, we're going to catch you and we're going to punish you, right? But as I said as well, sometimes we have kind of a conventional wisdom that there are some circumstances in which it is going to be easier for the business operator to really do any of these things, right? It's going to be easier for any of business operators to unilaterally exercise their market power unfairly, right? It is going to be easier for firms to collude with each other against the public, right? There are going to be some situation, and one situation we are quite well known come from this framework, the SCP framework. Right? In other words, this was coined, as I gave in the lecture earlier, was coined almost 70 years ago. Right? Actually, over 70 years ago, by economist called Joe Bain. Right? And what he proposed is basically sometimes, but this is actually later on used in the kind of, well, business application. All right, that how would you be a very successful player? How would you create what they call a competitive advantage, right? And the one who actually implement this kind of idea is what we call is the one we called Michael Porter. He's like a godfather in the business strategy field, but it is a thing for another course. All right, but the whole idea of this Joe Bain's, right? Joe Bain proposition is that you can have structure, and that structure would lead to conduct. Okay, you can sort of map with the sort of direction to the right here. You have certain structure, you can predict certain pattern of conduct, and eventually that will lead to certain performance. And competition laws sort of know this, that if you have certain kind of structure, it would trigger or it would allow you, again, to do something in terms of conduct. And this is why, for example, if the market concentration is greater, this is structure, right? Market concentration means that now you have less and less firms. You have fewer firms in the market. You could predict that it is easier because if you have fewer players, it essentially means that, well, the likelihood that you can have some more big players. And if you have some more big players, well, either it could be the case that one of them exercises the market power unilaterally in the abusive manner, or it could be the case that these big players and also among these fewer players, they would make certain kind of agreement to limit their competition, right? And that is why sometimes we would like to kind of control this in advance. And that is why we learn about merger control. Okay, so now we we have another element of ex-ante. Why it is called ex-ante? Because, as I said, being big or having fewer players in the market is super normal, right? Because, for example, now you've seen a lot of players jumping into the AI market. Okay, there are different layers of AI market which we're gonna talk about today. But eventually, I mean, for example, OpenAI might go out of the market because they can't compete against bigger player like Google, right? Or Anthropic, they probably can become big and will become a dominant player. But some smaller player, for example, Perplexity, might be unable to compete and have to go out of the market or shift themselves into a different market. I'm not predicting anything, but I'm just giving the idea that now there's so many players playing the same game, but eventually some player might need to go out, some player might need to shift to other markets, some player remain and getting bigger because consumers consumer adopt them more and more, right? And eventually that gonna concentrate the market and make fewer players. So there's nothing wrong. That is pretty much a very normal economic phenomenon, which actually quite contrary. We should support and promote that sort of outcome. If the way towards it is the kind of fair, kind of sensible, and kind of like productive ones, right? They compete against each other. They have developed their own innovation. That should be good. But again, there's one way that we could have this sort of bigger player, which is pretty much well, they can merge, right? They can merge, which essentially could be the case that one big firm buy the smaller firm and the smaller firm become a part of the big firm, or these two firms can merge and become a bigger firm. All right, or it's just gonna be well, the case that you merge with and you become the new firm, right? So essentially there are different modes, but what is clear is that initially we have two players, but after the merger or acquisition, they become one player. Essentially means that we have fewer players. We've seen a few of the larger sort of merger cases in Thailand so far, right? True and DTAC, right? Well, we've seen in the energy sector, Bangchak and Esso, right? We've seen in the modern trade, Lotus and CP, right? So we've seen these cases in the past. And what is quite clear is that we're going to have fewer players. And with that structure, it is likely that, well, it is going to be easier. I'm not saying that they're going to do it. But it's going to be easier for them to exercise market power because they have more market power. And one of the main reasons is because consumers have fewer choices. It's going to be easier for them to collude because now there are not that many players. And one of the most kind of like clear prevalence of the tendency that firms will collude with each other is that, well, you have fewer players. It is easier to manage this kind of agreement and make sure the player would play along the agreement that you have made. All right, so that is the reason why there's another two, which is ex-ante. Ex-ante in the sense that there's nothing wrong yet, but because I know that you're going to concentrate the market, and I mean through merger and acquisition, and I would like to have a look at it first, right? I would like to have a look at it first, and I would like to assess if where the reduction of competition will be at the level that I need to be concerned, and more importantly, if it's going to be of concerns, I'm going to impose certain kind of conditions, which is the remedies, right? I'm going to impose remedies, and the extreme cases I'm going to prohibit you. But most of the cases, say 90% of the cases, well, it is not going to be to sort of prohibition. It's going to be remedies in the sense that once you merge, for example, if you are modern trade, you have 100 branches. Well, some of the branches you become monopoly in the area. I won't allow you. So I will allow you to merge only in the areas that you won't become a monopoly. In those areas that you will become a monopoly, if you want to sell your business, you have to sell to the third party, right? That is remedy as well, which is what we call the structural remedy, right? And in the another alternative is the behavioral remedies. Like, look, if you're gonna merge now, the supplier, again, the example of modern trade, right? You are now the shelves of the pork or any agricultural product, for example, vegetable, fruits, any kind, you name it. In the old days, before merger, these suppliers, you can imagine of farmers or agricultural firms, they have this sort of choice, right? If this sort of shelf, I mean, this brand of modern trade put any kind of, well, undesirable conditions, you can switch to the others. And why by switching, this is modern trade who imposes sort of unfair or undesirable conditions would have to improve their offer, right? And that is what we call competitive process. But once they merge, now you don't have anywhere to turn to, because you probably have to accept a worse condition. In that case, well, the competition commission can say something along the line of, look, you have to keep the conditions the same, but it probably not indefinitely, right? But you probably have to keep the condition the same for the next 3 years, the next 5 years. And then for these suppliers to really have to adjust themselves, to have ability to 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 really adjust or find other alternatives or even climb up the ladder. But again, if you find that these behavioral remedies won't really help, you should eventually go to the structural remedies as well. And that is why most cases you need both, right? Well, sometimes you're gonna call this called what we call unwind, right? Unwind merger. Like this is a case ongoing, right? On Meta, but that is not on a merger per se, and that is on an abuse of dominance. But Meta, as we discussed earlier, they bought WhatsApp and well, Instagram, right? Pretty much almost a decade ago, and seems that they probably are they are being alleged of exercising this dominant position in this social media market and in the abusive manner, which is abuse of dominance. And one of the possibilities of the remedies is this could be the structural remedies in which Meta, which is Facebook, might be forced to unwind the merge. In other words, they have to sell Instagram or WhatsApp to the third party or split into the independent companies, which is going to be a big one. It's going to be the big one. But we have to wait and see that decision because it hasn't come out yet. All right. So that is pretty much the whole competition tools which we covered. I mean, this is of course apart from the sort of market definition, how we draw it, where the market is, single business entity, right? But this is essentially what we have covered. I recap all of these again. One of the main reasons because we are getting towards the end of the course. But at the same time, I would like to kind of recap them because we're going to go into some sort of more frontier of the topic in which we're going to learn about two particular kind of markets that have their own very unique situations, which is digital platforms and artificial intelligence, which are the technologies, if you like, at the frontier, by the forefront of the global innovation at the moment. Okay, any questions or anything that you would like me to elaborate further before we move on to the lecture? Okay. let's talk about I'm gonna sort of split this into 3 modules, all right? Which we're gonna get into detail. But first, I think I want to talk about what it means by digital platforms and why it is so powerful. I think essentially you can think about a digital platform as this case. We learn about abuse of dominance, right? Digital platform is kind of the market. Well, there are different markets within digital platforms, right? For example, social media, app store, right? Video streaming like YouTube. There are different markets within it. It which sometimes called core platform services in the wordings of European law, right? But well, there are some characteristics of it which make digital platform to be kind of more likely to be a dominant player by nature, right? And as you can see, when some particular settings lead some player to be a dominant player or even a monopoly, you probably want to keep a close eye on it, right? You want to keep a close eye on it and make sure that, again, they won't abuse their market power. Okay, so that's pretty much the same concept. And digital platform is just a specific case where this sort of abuse of dominance, first, very easy to happen. Second, well, as we know, the scale of it is not in a particular country. Well, the concern is at the regional or even the global level. All right. And then we talk about this sort of artificial intelligence, which kind of similar explanation to digital platform. It's become big and just a few players. I think one phenomenon that's quite clear is now the biggest firm in the world. Okay, which firm is the biggest firm in the world now in terms of market capitalization? Which one? What is the biggest firm in the world?
I think it's like NVIDIA, right?
Right, yes, it's NVIDIA, right? And look, if you, I mean, I was well, I was a geek when I was younger, right? Probably I still am. And in my days, which was probably 30 years ago, when I was starting using computer, learning about computer and or the hardwares and things, NVIDIA was there already, right? And you would not even have a glimpse of imagination that NVIDIA will become the biggest player in the world one day. Because what they did back then was basically like this sort of computer graphic, right? You have like, you play game and they have graphic cards, which is like, well, for gamers or even like, well, for those who would like to watch video on computer, which is now something super normal for you guys. But back in my days, computer was not the first choice because it's so slow. It's kind of like moving intermittently, but it's kind of like not smooth at all. And this sort of graphic was still underdeveloped. And you can imagine there's one piece of hardware, the company that produced that, which is not the only one either, would become the biggest player in the world. But now they are. And one of the main reasons is because of the rise of artificial intelligence. We're not even in the top 10 or even top 20 in just a couple of years ago. And now they become bigger than most of the players. They become the top one. And we don't even know when it ends, right? Because now they sort of, you can think about NVIDIA as just sort of like you dig into the land and basically you find a new kind of gold, which is that gold is the gold that generate brain for the machine, right? And that is actually a story that actually happened, and that sort of generate a value in the economy, and people just put all the money in it, and that is pretty much what the situation is. You are the one who provide that gold or oil, right? And NVIDIA is the one who provides a GPU, as we know, which is pretty much the unit of computer, the processing unit, if you like. that used to train these big models. Okay, so that's pretty much the situation. Okay, so we're gonna learn that market as well. But in two markets, it's quite clear that now we have seen this as an exponential demand, and well, with all these barriers, we've seen a huge barriers to entry. Okay, and that is why we would like to explore them. Well, I think now when we talk about these two things, right? Okay, well, what I've established is that, well, these two markets in particular seems to be problematic, seems to affect us a lot, and it will become more and more prevalent in our lives. I mean, both in terms of professionals and in terms of our daily life as well, our family, our well-being. We're going to see the doctor using AI. We're going to be a lawyer using AI. Some of us are going to be substituted by particular tasks of AI that AI can do much better and much more faster, right? So that's something that's going to affect all of us, and that's pretty much the market that we're going to be living our lives in. Okay, so it seems that we are now facing this what I call kind of trilemma, right? Trilemma. But the first branch of the trilemma is that when you talk about this artificial intelligence, or even digital platform, well, for example, this lunch, right? I have to stay at home, and well, basically, it is almost unimaginable 10 years ago that I would be able to stay at home for a week or even a month without going out to buy groceries or to buy food. But now this is very easy because we have this food delivery platform, right? And that is kind of innovation, right? So the first trilemma is, how can we protect and foster innovation? But at the same time, as you know, I mean, well, once player become big, there's a word, right? A saying that well, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupt absolutely, right? There's a saying, and that is not just true in terms of politics. It's true in most sense, whatever power you mean. And again, if player have this sort of, well, big market power, then they tends to exercise it in a very dodgy manner. And that is why you have to ensure this sort of fair competition as well. Right? Because, I mean, you see a lot of shops now rely on it. Yesterday, I went to this event on this parental talk about how you raise your children in the decades to come with the AI. And I think, well, so many things we discussed in a way, but one thing is quite clear is now a lot of us, I mean, maybe some of you as well, would like to be what we call influencer, right, or content generator. A lot of younger kids actually have this sort of aspiration, quite normal. Again, they are now have this sort of aspiration to be a part of this newly created market of social media, right? And again, that would have to rely on another player. And if that is going to be their future professions of our younger generation, we have to make sure that if they really jump into the market, they're going to be treated fairly, right? They're not going to exercise their rights in a way that would affect other people. Yeah, other people, I mean, probably they're going to be kind of like taken advantage by the platform themselves, but at the same time, the way they use the content, the way they, well, exercise this kind of like features online could affect people on the other side of the platform as well. And that is something we need to make sure that where the competition is truly fair. Okay. And that is the third one, is how can we safeguard the consumer welfare and fundamental rights. Right, you can see this kind of trilemma. And well, I think it's pretty much the tightrope that all regulators are walking anywhere in the world. I mean, not limited to European Union, but also in the US and also here in Thailand, where we have to think about the sort of regulatory attempts that we need to make. Okay, so I split today's lecture into 3 modules. The first one, I will lay out the theoretical groundwork, right? What I aim to do is we explore the sort of economic theory of platforms, right? And when we know why it is quite problematic, not problematic, but it's why it is quite unique when it comes to digital platform, then I'll show you probably the most outstanding attempt to really regulate it, which is the European Union's Digital Markets Act, okay, DMA, right? So that's the first module. So platform and DMA, Digital Market Act. All right. And the second module, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of comparative analysis. Well, I want to show you this kind of like different ways the different jurisdictions use. I mean, apart from this DMA, like, okay, how people do things. How do we really regulate this digital platform in other jurisdictions, right? And especially in our sort of neighbor, like ASEAN. What do we do? What are we trying to do? Because look, different countries and different regions will have different status for this, right? For example, the first branch of the trilemma, we know that we are lacking behind, of course, in terms of innovation. And the more burden we put on the players, well, of course, it's going to be less attractive for us to the foreign investors, but also from our local players as well. And one of the most prevalent problem here is that sometimes, well, if you impose any kind of regulations, it depends on the enforcement power. And most of the times, the one who get enforced the most are your local player. And if you split your local player into 2 groups, the first group is the group that has this sort of political mode or political strength they can exercise, they can pull strings. And smaller players like startups or relatively smaller players who don't have that kind of negotiation power against the policy or the government, it would turn out that eventually, I mean, we set aside those sort of multinational enterprises, like these sort of big tech companies, right? There are 3 groups of players, right? Big tech companies, like global companies, big local player, small local player. If you impose regulation or any kind of requirements, that is subject to the ability of you as the government officer to enforce it. For the first and the second group, it's going to be relatively more difficult for you to really enforce them. Well, because of the valid reason or because of the sort of invalid reason, well, possibly, right? But the one that actually going to get this sort of restriction the most is the one in the third category, which is a smaller domestic player. And that is why we have to be really careful, right? We have to be really careful when we think about this kind of regulation imposition when it comes to, well, the jurisdictions that have sort of different level of development, right? So that is why, as I said, it's kind of like you walking the tightrope. Okay, and we would go into this kind of AI, right? AI. And I would like to show you this market structure and pretty much the inputs that sort of define this battleground, if you like. Okay, at M3, module 3 is, let's talk about the synthesis of all of what we discussed. I would talk about a particular case in order to sort of reflect the concern, which is the case of Microsoft and OpenAI partnership, right? And if we have time, I might go into some other sort of particular technologies, like decentralized technologies, that could become the solution to this. Okay, so that's pretty much what I would like to go into detail. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, which is, well, we start with a question, right? In the previous slides, that why platform wins. Okay, why platform wins, and it is important to understand that the platform tends to be big and have just a smaller set of players because of the nature of it, which we call multi-sided market. Okay, sometimes it's called two-sided market, but essentially you can have more than two sides. Okay, for example, you think about ride-hailing platform, right? Lyman or Grab. You have restaurant on one side, right? Or those restaurant get want to buy that, want to sell their foods. You have a group of riders on another side, right, who come and become this connectors between the shop and people on the other side, who is the customers, right? There are three sides within that ride-hailing platform market. Okay, so but essentially the theory of this two-sided would be able to generalize into that. Well, most of the time when we talk about sort of traditional markets, in the contrary of two-sided markets, you think about a company sells a product to a customers, right? That is kind of like natural. But when it's come to multi-sided, it is quite different. This is not new, right? The foundational work here come from, well, a few people, but one guy who actually at the heart and center of it is the Nobel laureate, which is quite recently, is Shong Diro. All right, Shong Diro, and another name is the Charles Roche. All right, these two economists, they wrote a paper in early 2000s that sort of discussed this theoretical aspect of what we call a two-sided market, right, to really understand. And essentially what it says is this, the platform, you think about platform, right? So the platform. Well, the platform, it actually can kind of need to draw people in. Yeah, they need to draw people in, which is something that we're gonna explore later. But what they can do essentially is they can affect the volume of transactions, right? Because I mean, they want more transactions, right? Because most of the time, that business model, they would like to get this commission, right? If I buy, I mean, if I book a hotel on the online travel agency like Booking.com or Agoda, they charge on commission, right? Like the percentage of the booking fees, or sorry, pretty much the booking fees, right? How much do I pay for the room? And then they charge like 10-15%, depending on, well, factors. All right. But what they can do is, so they would like to boost this kind of transactions to happen on the platform as much as possible. And they can actually affect the volume of transaction by charging more to one side and reduce the price paid by the other sides. Right. So they can do what we call subsidization. All right. This is very important because now we are not talking about the price level. We are talking about the price structure. Right? So it's not just the price level, but the way that you say, look, I'm going to reduce the price here substantially, but I know that I can charge it here. You can think about this as a commission rate, right? I'm going to reduce the price for consumers. If you go back in time a little bit for 4 or 5 years, but especially during the COVID, well, a lot of platforms find a very good opportunity, and that is why you got a lot of discount, right? You go on the Grab, you buy delivery from all these platforms. It's going to be super cheap. Even nowadays, right? It's going to be super cheap in terms of these sort of delivery fees, right? And sometimes it's just 0 or 10 baht for like this kind of like 20 kilometers. And that is ridiculously cheap. But what they do is, because they can set the price structure in such a way that you reduce the price on one side, and you know that a lot of consumers will go to your platform, and eventually the shop will need to sell it on your platform, and you can increase the price because now you have negotiation power. All right, so that is what I mean by price structure. It is like you are tuning 2 parameters, not just the price level, right? And that is now has become what we call a critical strategic variable. All right, but you probably don't have to go into that kind of like more advanced something that has been around for decades is the credit card. Right? You must get these sort of shops on board, like the merchants, different shops in the department store on the street. And you must get shoppers who is pretty much the card holders on board as well. And that is pretty much the idea that you need more than one side in order for your platform to be valuable. And essentially, that's the platform are pretty much what we call matchmakers. And this is sort of, as I said, right, it's going to create what we call a chicken and egg problem. Right? It is pretty much if you just form a new platform, for example, one day you want to form this platform for lawyers, right? If you just form this platform, but it is very difficult from the very beginning that you would be able to attract, let's say, business users. In the lawyer matching is the lawyers, right? How would you attract the lawyers from the very beginning? But at the same time, you don't have lawyers on the platform, no users, no clients who go to your platform either. All right, so you can see that this is pretty much what we call a colossal barrier to entry. It is very difficult to start it. But the question is like, how do we solve it? Like, especially the incumbents or the players who are actually in the market already. And that is the key term that I just coined earlier, subsidization. Incumbents solve coordination via costly subsidization, right? And pretty much the approach they use is what they call divide and conquer. Right. In other words, they're sort of heavily subsidize one side of the market. And that's in this case, they subsidize this side of the market, right, which is usually users or consumers, in order to build what you call a critical mass. Right? If you have a lot of these people coming in, you're gonna have a critical mass. For example, you can think about Google, right? It's sort of providing you free search. If you have to pay even 1 baht per one search, trust me, it's going to reduce the number of people who are users of Google, and it's not worth it, especially at the very beginning of Google. Right? But that is why Google provides free search to billions of end users. And of course, starting with 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and eventually now they have billions of end users. And it is impossible without this sort of free service provided at the very beginning. But now you have this sort of critical mass, right? You build an audience, then you can go and talk to businesses who would like to sell their sell their products, right? They would like to show their advertisement, and then you can say like, look, yeah, now we have billions and billions of viewers. Would you like to pay us so we can show it to the people that is most likely to click on it and convert into your customers, right? Because we have billion of them, and now we are trying to know them inside out in order to generate this value. All right, so that is the theory of two-sided markets. And what happened is this: we have what we call the tipping point dynamics, right? Once the platform sort of solve this coordination problem, what we call a powerful force of tipping point dynamic would take over, which is sometimes we call network effect. What do we mean by network effect? Well, I would say the network effect is the central feature of the business model which we have just discussed. And there are mainly two kinds of it. All right, there are mainly two kinds of it. The first one, I'll take this picture again, okay? You have a platform, whichever kind you like, all right? And this could be the business, this could be end consumer. You have direct network effect, or in other words, it's called same side effect. The definition of it is the value of the service increases as more users on the same side join. When you think of the early days of like Facebook or Messenger service, its utility increases with each friend who joins, right? So you think about social media at the very beginning, right? And or even, well, in the old days, if you look at the UI, I mean, user interface of Facebook, it's kind of ugly, but it's quite clean as well. It's kind of like the place that you go and chat with your friends, right? You kind of like just say hi on their wall. They're gonna reply on the wall as well. So it's pretty much just a space that you talk to people, and purely that. And that is quite relatively still kind of one-sided in a little bit in nature. You kind of like, well, and the value of it, you go there because your friends are there, and your friends were there because you were there, right? And that is kind of network effect. That the more your friends are there, you want to play it. Like Messenger as well. In the old days when I was young, this is a Microsoft Messenger. It's called MSN, or even earlier than that, it's called ICQ. You probably never heard of it, ICQ, which is like gone already. It comes from the word I seek you, and that is why the product is called ICQ, which is very popular chat service. But again, it's sort of gone because the only thing it does is basically provide you with this sort of chat software, right? Another kind is indirect network effect, which is a cross-site. This is very important. For example, you think about shopping platform, right? Like Amazon or Shopee or Lazada. The value of shoppers, right here, the value of shoppers increases as more shops here join. And likewise, the value for shops increase as more shoppers join. And you have this sort of feedback loop, right? These effects sort of create a powerful, what we call positive feedback loop, right? Positive feedback loop. More users attract more businesses, which in turn attract more users. And this eventually leads to a tipping point where the market sort of rapidly consolidates into one or two dominant platforms, right? And that is why we call this market as winner take all. And once you become big, as I said, once you become a dominant player, the platform powers is entrenched. Okay, this is another term which has been used a lot in the term in the field. It's called entrenchment. Right. The platform power is kind of entrenched by the sort of high switching costs. And switching costs, as I said, as I mentioned very earlier, it is not just a financial cost. Right. You can see a lot of work in the field of economics, like by the guys like Klempera. It's so many things, right? Like you think about data loss, right? Data loss. Basically, for example, your search history and your photos, right? If you switch, or sometimes they won't go with you. Right? The loss of network. You have tons of contacts. You have lots of friends on your Instagram, your followers, and this is actually very important, right? Because if you are sticking to one platform and you have tons, like maybe 100,000 or even million of followers on that platform, and one day you switch to another, there's no guarantee that your followers would follow you, right? Because they are probably not your sole follower. They also follow other people on that platform as well, right? And also the cognitive relearning. This is probably very important, right? You have this sort of cognitive burden of learning a new interface. Okay, and this is pretty much what creates, again, another technical term, lock-in effect. Right? The lock-in means that even if a better or cheaper competitor emerges, which in traditional sense should be fine, right? It's still profoundly difficult for that sort of new competitor to gain a foothold. So you can see so many studies out there. For example, a study on Facebook analyzes various switching costs to determine if they confer sufficient market power to violate traditional antitrust law or not. And it seems to be quite clear that it is, right? So now you can see that these dominant players, they are not just dominant players, but there is this course of nature, if you like, to sort of protect their position as well. In other words, the competitive process has become even more difficult because whatever you do, your competitors find it very difficult to jump into it because there are so many inertia. There's so many forces against people to switch to other players. All right. But any questions so far? Any kind of like reflection you want to share, please? Well, feel free to come through in the chat box as well if you want. Chat box, not a chat box. Okay, I've seen London. Let's go ahead. Okay, so I hope you see quite a clear picture now. All right. And the next question is like, look, we have all the exposed and threats as I said, right? We have abuse of dominance in place. We have unfair trade practices. We have, well, cartels, enforcement. We even have merger control. We should be okay, shouldn't we? The problem is that there are some limits to these sort of exposed antitrust, right? And that's sort of profound challenge to the traditional competition law is actually because of the reason we discussed earlier, right? Again, let me emphasize, exposed antitrust kind of like we wait for a company to abuse its dominant position, right? And that sort of take years of investigation and then perhaps apply a remedy. So this sort of exposed approach is likely arriving at a fire after the building has already burned to the ground. So in other words, it's too late. And in these kind of dynamic winner-take-all markets, by the time that the regulator, even TCCT or CMA in the UK or anywhere in the world, FTC in the US or DOJ in the US as well, by the time that these regulators have spent years proving the case, for example, the case with Google or other cases, it takes like, well, years, right? Or even a decade. The market is probably gone already. The harm is kind of entrenched. The competitors date, which is sad. And we've seen that. I mean, you go back in the past history, there are so many papers out there that look back into the past and see so many firms that actually gone And that is why some people even say that there were what they call killer acquisition, which is essentially the case that big firms, big tech firms, they buy these sort of smaller startups just because they see them as a potential threat in the future, and they buy them and they let them die, right? And that is one of the well, this is kind of hard to prove because some people would say that look, it's well, startup tend to fail anyway. So how would you prove that this is a killing acquisition, or it's just another acquisition of the high risk firms that tend to die anyway? So yeah, but you probably cannot prove all the cases, but also difficult to prove otherwise either. You can't say that all these acquisitions are not killer and have done with all PR sort of intent of building the new firms, the new unicorn. Not always either. So the idea is, yeah, we've seen that the harm is kind of entrenched and the competitor has died a lot, and the market has apparently tipped. Right? If you look at the biggest firms in the world, especially the top 10, you've seen that their market cap has increased more than 10 times, right, in the past 20 years. They were not even on the monitor of even like 100 or 500. Most of them were not even accessed 20 years ago, and now they become top 10, right? If you look at them, well, NVIDIA, we set that aside for now, but you look at Meta, you look at Google, which is Alphabet, and you have seen that this is kind of quite clear that they have been tipped, right? They have been tipping the market. And this kind of ideological failure has forced a global rethink, because that is why they sort of lead to this kind of ex-ante regulation, right? This model sort of imports from the sectoral regulations like telecommunication. Essentially, it's kind of like it won't wait for the abuse to happen, but it identifies a status, right? A status. This is kind of like a clear technical term. It identifies this a status, right? In other words, it's like an entity with systemic market power. Because you look at these sort of particular sectors like telecommunication or energy, they, even though they don't have this clear network effect, but they do have a certain characteristic of network effect, right? Because we, as the consumers of electricity, we have this middleman, right? We actually take electricity from the producers and then distribute it to us, and they work to a certain extent as a platform, right? Even though most of them are pretty much just a few players, or even in the Bangkok metropolitan area, they are pretty much monopoly, right? And so they pretty much work in the middle as well, and they have this kind of network effect, and they can justify this since a very early history of economics, because they have this economics of scale, right? They get big. It's just cheaper for each individual to be on them, and the government would just regulate their behavior for them not to abuse. And that is what the idea of ex-ante regulation. You have a market in which you admit that it might be okay because of the nature of it to have just a few players, even only player, and that is what we call the status. Or sometimes in the telco, sometimes it's called SMP, which is a significant market player or significant market power player, right? And then it applies a set of preventative rules. This kind of do's and don'ts, right? You sort of put some kind of limit to the behavior before they can cause harm. All right, and if you look at this table, you're going to see this kind of distinction between ex post and ex ante regulation. You see different features, right? If you look at this kind of like ex post competition law in terms of philosophy, it's kind of remedial, right? Remedial in the sense that you wait and you punish this sort of past anti-competitive conduct, right? But for the ex ante, you kind of preventative in the sense that you prevent it. You set the rules, say, look, I know that you're a big player. DMA call these players gatekeepers, which we will come to that later. Essentially, next slide. Which is actually a very good term, right? Because if you think about the platform, it's kind of like if you become so big, you are essentially a gatekeeper, right? You prevent one side to meet the other side. Not prevent, but you are regulating this kind of meeting between a player from different sides, right? And that is why the target is that you wait until for the exposed, you wait until the dominant player abuse their power. But ex ante, you don't wait. You say the dominant player, you have to follow these rules. All right. Another distinction which is very important is this burden of proof, right? Because they are quite different in terms of burden of proof. For the exposed, most of the time, the one who has this sort of burden of proof has to be regulated, right? That they have to prove this sort of dominant position and the abusive conduct on a case-by-case basis. But for the ex-ante, the undertaking, in other words, these sort of big tech or big platforms are presumed to be a gatekeeper if it meets certain thresholds, all right, which we talk about later. And the burden is on the gatekeeper to comply with the preset rules. So now you kind of like, well, release or unleash some kind of burden to pretty much to be held by the big player instead of the regulator. And the speed is much faster, right? Because now you're not talking about the conduct that is against the law, which is you need this kind of investigation and proof, a lot of proof, right? In the criminal offense, you go beyond reasonable doubt. But when it comes to regulations, or especially the obligations you impose ex ante, but the violation would just come from not doing that kind of obligation. And this is much faster in theory, at least. And outcome, again, in the experts can be fines or remedies of different kinds. But for the ex ante, we can have sort of prescriptive obligations and prohibitions. Right? For example, like gatekeepers shall not do this and that. So you can see this shift, right? This shift from the ex post to ex ante. It's kind of like, I think the core change of this is the burden of proof and speed, right? And that is why we would have a look at this Digital Market Act, which is kind of the replacement of a case-by-case analysis of harm, right? And by setting some clear, predefined rules for all designated gatekeepers. All right, so let's take a quick break of 10 minutes, and then we come back and we learn how Digital Market Act works. What kind of obligations are we talking about, and why do we have to impose them? All right, we come back at 10:40 to discuss further. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Right, let's any question before we continue our material? All right. Okay, let's talk about digital market apps. I mean, the content itself deserve like a separate lecture, if you like, in order to really do justice to it. But I think I wanted to just sort of let's talk about this kind of like the main idea of it first, okay, before we continue. So the Digital Market Act has come into force since 2023, and again, this kind of like grace period, if you like, was lasting for a year until March 2022. And as we know, the nature of competition, this kind of ex-ante competition law is not to punish. Okay, it's kind of like to impose certain kind of obligations in order to make the digital markets contestable and fair. And the way to do it is, if you remember, they have to define a player or a status, right? A particular player that they would like to keep a close eye on, right? So the logic of DMA is quite simple. You kind of identify the titans, if you like, the giant, and then give them the new rule book, right? This kind of identification process is defined in Article 3 of the DMA. You can look at these sort of different benchmarks here, but the idea is that, look, there is a principle, and I mean, the principle being a titan, whatever it means, right? Pretty much a big player, a gatekeeper, right? And there is a set of quantitative criteria, so that it's easier for, especially for the regulator, and also for the benefit of the kind of tech companies or potentially big players to be able to identify themselves, right? So the logic is like that, and an undertaking is designated as a gatekeeper if it meets three qualitative criteria. Right, the first, significant impact, which means that it has a significant impact on the market. In the European term, the use internal market is basically the 27 countries within the European Union, right? The second is it provides a core platform service that is an important gateway for business to reach end users, right? That's the first. That's the second. It's called core platform services, right? Like search engine, video streaming, social media, app stores, and so on and so forth, right? And that's pretty much what I mean by core platform services. So core platform services. You could imagine, right? One gatekeeper. This is at the firm level, right? At the business operator level, could have different CPS in it, right? Like you think about Alphabet or Google, where they have a YouTube, right, which is one that is active in the CPS called video streaming, right? They have search engine, of course, and that is Google. And again, that's another CPS. So you can be one gatekeeper with more than one core platform services, all right? And the third is that you enjoy an entrenched and durable position. Entrenched and durable position, she's a third. But that is quite conceptual, right? That is why they establish what we call quantitative presumptions. right? They kind of introduce this sort of quantitative presumptions to make sure that there's no ambiguity. Right? I would like you to notice the word presumptions, right? Because so this is something that you can prove otherwise, right? When it's called presumption, it's kind of like, I presume that you are gatekeeper because of these parameters, but you can prove otherwise. All right, so that's the way it works. And there are again 3 quantitative presumptions, which is essentially correspond to 3 criteria set in the qualitative manner above. Okay, the first one is on size, right? Significant impact. What do you mean by that? So it becomes size, right? It becomes size. And annual, so yearly, EU turnover equal to above 7.5 billion euro, right? Or, all right, so that is the best thing. You look at the turnover, or a global market cap of at least 75 billion. All right, if you look at the world market cap as 75 billion, or if you are quite a big player in the European Union, but you're probably not that big in the world, and your turnover in the EU is greater than 7.5 billion euro in the previous year, of course, then that is going to be considered as a significant impact. And the easiest way is to use the size, right? Use size as a proxy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do you know that this player is an important gateway? Right? How do you know that this one is like acting as a gateway, kind of regulating the way that people will interact across different sides of the market? And the proxy for this is, of course, the number of users, right? So the second one, the number of users. All right. Again, but now this case is like 2 sides, both, right? The first one is that you must have at least 45 million monthly active EU end users, right? For the part of end users, you have 45 people active on a monthly basis, and at least 10,000 yearly active EU business users. All right. So that's the second one, which is a proxy for the important gateway. And the third, how would you know that this position is kind of entrenched and durable position? They sort of attach it to the gateway, which is the second condition here, the second quantitative presumption, that you have to enjoy this position of having 45 million monthly active EU end users and more than 10,000 yearly active EU business users for the last 3 years, right? That is what I mean by entrenchment. Okay, the proxy of entrenchment is you have that position for at least 3 years. Okay, and having those quantitative presumptions, in September 2023, the Commission, right, the European Commission designated 6 gatekeepers. Again, gatekeepers, you can have more than core platform services within it. Okay, which are the name that we are quite familiar with: Alphabet, Amazon, Apple. Alphabet is again Google. Okay, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, which is TikTok, right? Meta, and Microsoft. Right. So these are the firms that fall within this criteria of quantitative presumptions. Some of them argue in certain core platform services that they are not gatekeepers, and that is their own rights to do, because again, this is quantitative presumptions. All right, is everything clear so far? So far, so good. Any question? All right. I presume no news is a good news. Okay, so the next step is, okay, now we know who the gatekeepers are. So what, right? Because you told me that, well, you're gonna call some big players or titans, if you like, as gatekeepers, and you can impose certain kind of obligations. What kind of obligations are we talking about? And that is actually written in the Articles 5, 6, and 7. All right. So once these designated players are called gatekeepers, they would have to comply with a list of do's and don'ts, which are detailed in Article 5, 6, and 7 of the Act itself. All right. Again, I mean, these obligations are not random wish lists. They are pretty much a very kind of surgical, sort of legislative response, if you like, to very specific economic theories of harm. Okay, another term which I introduced early in the term, but I would like to sort of stress it again that you see it as a theory of harm. Again, when you think about this kind of dominant position or anti-competitive conducts, the question is like, what's the harms, right? Well, why do you think that this action or this conduct, well, sometimes we use these two terms interchangeably. Why do you think that these sort of conducts should be prohibited or should be controlled or regulated? The key idea is you have to come up with what we call the theories of harm. Why it is harmful? Why do you think this conduct is undesirable to, again, competitive process or whatever objectives you are trying to achieve, right? And again, if you're gonna impose certain kind of obligations, do's and don'ts to these designated gatekeepers, you will need to explain that as well. All right. So, well, there are so many obligations in Article 5 and 6, but let me just sort of extract some of the very prominent one, and I explain why these obligations are there in order to sort of make sure that you understand them. All right. So let's look at these two articles mainly, Article 5 and Article 6. The first one is what we call the exploiting gateway power or high rents. Okay. That is economic harm. In other words, that is something that you can do that is going to be harmful to the competitive process in the market. In other words, now you are gateway. Now you control the player from joining, and I mean player to from. You sort of control the way people are interacting, right? You control the channels through which the restaurants can sell their food. You control the channels through which the hotel can sell their rooms. You control the channel where these content creators can earn money from their creativity or their efforts. When you have that power, what you can do naturally as a business, you would like to have greater profit, right? In other words, you want to have higher rents. And that is the first thing. You exploit gateway power, which is the direct correspondence with the abuse of dominance in general on pricing, right? That is why specific obligations, for example, the don't is you have to prohibit or you are prohibited from anti-steering prohibition. All right. We should say explicitly that the gatekeeper shall not prevent business users from offering the same services at different prices or conditions on their direct channels. All right, on their own direct channels. Well, let me single out this a little bit and then talk a little bit more. Sometimes this is called, well, rate parity clause. Rate parity clause. Right? It could be the situation which, for example, I put my room, I'm a hotel owner, I put my room on OTA, for example, Agoda, and then they told me that, look, the price that you give on this room on this night, you give me, for example, 1,000 baht per night. You cannot give a better rate, anything cheaper than 1,000 baht per night on that particular day, to the other platforms or even your own website. right? That is what we call anti-steering or rate parity clause, in a sense, like, and that is a very typical practice in the industry in the past. They just put it there and say that you can't do that, and you can see the sort of the rationale behind it, right? Why they want to do that, because for the platform, that is their main income. And you can think about platform that they sort of give this sort of showcase to the hotel as well. For example, you go to search on Agoda, and you can see all this sort of comparison, right? You see all the features of the hotel, make it much more easy for you in order to compare and contrast against all different alternatives. But eventually, what you do is you go straight to the hotel's website, and then you book it, and all the users do that. The question is like, how would I get any income as the owner of the platform, right? If people do that, and that is what we call the free rider problem. So having this clause in place is kind of reasonable to some extent, yeah. You remember this trilemma. You have to balance, right? If you protect consumers too much, you are compromising the gatekeepers or these sort of digital platforms potential business, which is actually a legit business opportunity for them as well. And that is why these sort of non-steering or anti-steering or rate parity clause, whatever you like, has its own kind of different scope, right? You can have this sort of narrow, or you can have this sort of wider scope. The narrow one would be basically, for example, just that you prohibit them from selling the better rate on other digital platform, for example. Like Agoda say that you can't sell it on trip.com or on Traveloka at a better rate on a specific night. But that is narrow. But for the wider or the broader scope, you could go all the way to the hotel's website itself, or even walk-in customers. All right. And you can see here that now the European Union, especially the DMA, just put that on their own direct channels, right? They just use on their own direct channel, on direct channel, which is the narrow scope now, right? Because you can't stop them from going to their own direct channels, but you can stop them. You can stop them from giving the better rate to the other competing platform. In other words, this sort of article, the section 5, subsection 3, anti-steering prohibition, is trying to say something along the line like, I want platform to be able to kind of impose this kind of restriction, among themselves, but I don't want them to take advantage over these sort of business operators or business users who are using that platform, because they are gatekeepers, right? So they use the narrow scope. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then the question is like, wow, so this is going to be collusion or not? The answer is like, well, some people say yes. Some people say, look, why don't you just prohibit in all possible manners? But at the same time, as I said, you think about this sort of free rider problem, right? It is going to be unfair as well if you let me, using booking.com, very well designed user interface and user experience, and then I would just go to book at another platform which is competing against booking.com. Who is going to be the free rider of the attempt that booking.com is trying to develop their product? And that is kind of like disincentivize good player as well, right? So we have to strike the balance there. All right. But tying enforcing use of services, this is classic, right? If you use this service of mind, you would have to use that service as well. And that is why they impose this anti-tying. In other words, the gatekeepers shall not require users to use its own payment system, browser engines, or identification service as a condition of using the platform, right? You can think about if you're a big player in social media or in the marketplace, e-marketplace, and then the users will have to use your own payment system as well, right? They can't really use other sort of credit cards. Well, in other words, you are actually in the payment terms in the market. If you are so big, well, consumers will probably won't have choice, or they will have to use your payment system, even though maybe the commission rate is higher. And more importantly, there are also other players in that ecosystem that will provide just the payment system as well. And there are so many players in there. Or you can think about browser engines, right? If you are having this operation system, which normally we have just two, right? We have OS, which is the operation system of Apple. We have the OS of the PC, which is essentially Windows, right? And if you were forced directly or indirectly to use their own web browsers, the OS is going to be Safari, and for the Microsoft is going to be Edge, right? And that is going to be unfair to other players like Google or Mozilla or other players who are not having their own operation system. All right, you can see why, because you're a gatekeeper, and that is why you have to sort of comply with this contestable obligations, right? Data-driven self-preferencing, that's the third, all right? This is important as well. What does it mean by this? In Article 6, subsection 2, say that the problem is that what they're afraid is data siloing, right? The gatekeeper shall not use any non-public data generated by its business users to compete against those same business users, right? You can think about, we haven't got this thing so clear yet, but I don't know when it will come. It's probably just a matter of when. But if you think about Amazon has its own Amazon Basics, which is kind of like cheap product like duvet or any kind of household products. And Amazon can, and actually they did, use the seller data of the same product, right? Same like duvet, some electronic gadgets that they sell as the Amazon Basics, which is their own product. So in other words, in this sense, Amazon acts both as the platform, but also as a business user as well. And they kind of like use the information they get as a platform to get preference to their hat as a business user. And that is unfair to the other business users, right? Because now you are the business platform. The most recent case that Google got fined for $2 billion is essentially here as well. You in that case, it's kind of like you have this sort of advertisement market, right? In the Google search, but Google also act as a player themselves in providing this kind of like agency service, and also pretty much they are in the whole system, and they give the preference to their own businesses against their competitors who are using their platform, which is essentially the ad-based and the search engine, right? And that is pretty much here. And now they will need to refrain from using that sort of data that is generated from their business users in this case, all right, from competing against themselves. Okay, so that's data-driven self-preferencing. Another thing which is quite similar is algorithmic self-preferencing. This is directly, right? It's kind of like you don't have to use the data, but you just put it in the algorithm. Right? And that is why I say the gatekeeper shall not treat its own services more favorably in ranking, right? For example, this sort of, if you search Google, in the past especially, what we show first is the Google Shopping rather than any other shopping platform. And that is because of the algorithm of Google sort of show their own product first, all right? Or one day Lazada or Shopee, they come up with their own product, it's going to be a problem as well. But some of you might ask, like, okay, well, what about this sort of last mall or this sort of like certifying shops? So that is another thing, right? That is kind of like you have some sort of more credible or sort of this sort of accredited shops that people can trust, and then that is probably another thing, right? And if you look at it, actually, there's a future for that as well. So that's another thing. All right. The next one is data lock-in and high switching costs, which in other words is basically say that if you remember, right, one of the switching costs is that you have all the history, all the user, all the settings, all your friends in it. And that is why it makes it so difficult for you to switch to the other platform and make competition or contestability more difficult. And the obligations here is that you have this data portability obligation, which is that you must provide end users with tools for effective portability and continuous real-time access to that data. You can imagine that if you use Instagram, right, and there's a, well, I don't know, which platform that you are using as a competitor to Instagram. Can you imagine? This is a picture and video based social media. What else? Which one are you using apart from Instagram? You can type in the chat if you like. Okay. Well, I would think of Snapchat maybe. That's one alternative. And then in doing that, there must be some kind of data portability, right? You can migrate your data, your history or whatever to the other one. But it's still very difficult in nature because how would you migrate your friends over there? How would you migrate chat history without the names or even information of your friends? And if you can't do that in real time manner, in a sense that you just keep the history of the chat, what's the point? Right? What's the point of doing that if your friends are not there? So this is very problematic in practice as well. Last one is no, the last two is like App Store monopoly. Again, when you are using OS, right? You go to App Store of Apple, and for quite a legitimate security reason, usually it's very difficult for you to go and load application into your computer yourself. Or even you can do that, but it's going to be at your own risk. All right. And that is why they forced App Store or these sort of App Store could be another core platform services, right? They must allow this sort of installation of third-party app stores and apps from outside its own store. In other words, you cannot just force people to download application only on App Store, but the app developer, for example, these sort of, I don't know, Perplexity, right, or any other like Chrome, or even ChatGPT or Zoom, but they should be able to provide their own channels, right? That you when you search for their app on App Store and you click into it, and you're going to go into their dedicated store, or you can actually download the App Store yourself, like the alternative, which is not the Apple's one or not the Google's one or any other app store, into your computer to use it as well, right? And the last thing is combination of data, especially across different platforms, right? I play, well, take for example, if I'm using Instagram and I also use WhatsApp and I use Facebook, and the question is like, do they combine data? The question is yes, they combine data because it allows them to understand you better. Why not, right? But that is sort of create this sort of unfair advantage for the gatekeepers in particular, especially the gatekeepers who have more than one core platform services. And that is why they have this kind of like data combination ban, right? Say something like, you shall not combine personal data from the core platform service with data from the other service without explicit user consent, right? Like Facebook and WhatsApp data, you need to ask explicit consent there. All right, and that is, I think you now see quite a clear picture of what we mean by this sort of prescriptive ex-ante regulation. All right, any questions so far? Okay. I try to look around and find this sort of early empirical evidence and critique. It has been in effect since March 2024. In other words, about a year and a half already. I think a lot of people have been quite concerning, to be honest. I mean, conceptually, it's pretty good. But we've seen a lot of reports. There were some reports, for example, from the sort of Center on Regulation in Europe. If you want to read it, you search this. Right, CERRE. This stands for the Center on Regulation in Europe. All right, and they did a report in 2025 assessing the DMA, and I think what is quite clear is a very complex regulation. The report says something which is actually a good lesson to learn, that it sort of warns of what we would call unintended consequences, right? Yeah, unintended consequences, like, well, a degradation in the consumer journey, because once you make this thing quite complicated, it sort of worsen the user journey, especially if you use this sort of different products within the same gatekeeper. But now your data is pretty much more difficult to be sort of allocated across different core platform services, especially in the last obligations that we discussed right in the previous slide, or the reduction in the security of the digital services, because now you have to make it more sort of portable. So everything sort of comes with consequences. That is sort of normal. The report also talked about this sort of costs that are front-loaded, which the benefits that we discussed earlier sometimes, I mean, it's kind of take time to materialize. And of course, I mean, with just 1.5 years of this implementation, it's going to take some time for the benefit to materialize, but the cost is prevalent and it's there already, right? So we haven't seen anything yet. But again, if you believe that it sort of matters, it's going to take time. And most of the time, this happens in all regulation, right? I mean, the cost of compliance is there, but is pretty much the benefits may be very difficult to measure, or maybe take a decade or even longer to really realize. And that is sometimes in the short term, if you are a regulator, if you're the government, you really need this kind of, well, system to make sure that you think about long-term consequences as well. And that is a very difficult, if you come back to Thailand, you think about our political instability. Most of government know that they won't be here, even for 4 years, it could be much shorter. Who on earth is going to think about something of the long term? And that is why most of the digital regulations, I mean, are pretty much stalled. They get pretty much put on hold. We have this Digital Service Act, Digital Market law, which has been in the legislative process for quite some time. Now it has been put on hold. And you see the tension there, right? I mean, the cost is there, and you're going to get lobbied against it by those who need to be compliant. But the benefit is not there yet. And this thing is super complicated. And that is why the voice from the benefit side would probably will not reach the government. And if the government won't be there for that long, probably they don't need to care about it. You need to care about the sort of short-term benefits. Right? And that is kind of like something that you really need to think hard about, how to really make it effective and truly fair to all stakeholders. All right. In terms of compliance, I mean, a lot of people are still finding this case of non-compliance, right? Apple, Meta got accused quite a lot. For example, if you go to app stores or wallets and accessories in it, you still see that Apple got quite a bit of complaint that they tend to comply with it, but not really, right? And well, Meta actually came up with what they call the equivalent service without a fee requirement for the data processing. In other words, they impose like something of like, if you want to use a good service, you have to pay. Otherwise, you have to give us your data processing consent. And that is actually got overturned by the court already, saying that this is not a legitimate condition to put. But that is not under the DMA per se. That is under the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union. All right. So I think from all these things, it's kind of like bring us to a critical or third order observation, right? Third order already, because we discussed the rationale of it and why we need it. The ex-ante model is only as strong as its enforcement, right? Well, we've seen report that highlights that the fines of non-compliance. I mean, following an investigation of roughly a year and a half period, that the fines are relatively small. So far, some of the companies that got fined already is like Apple. Well, Apple, they got fined for 500 million euros. All right. Another company that got fined is Meta, which is from the things that we talked earlier, right? Apple is on the App Store and Meta is on this sort of. Meta say something like, if you want to use my beta service, you have to pay me. But if you don't, you're gonna get the compromised version. But if you want to use the full version without paying, you have to give us the right to process your data, which is quite a trick. And I think that's quite clear. There is a book which I think for those of you who are keen on reading, this book is called Careless People. Careless People. All right. It is written by this lady called Sarah Wynne Williams. I think I can capture the book for you. Okay. Give me a second. Okay. Does it work? All right, it works now. It has taken so long. But anyway, let me find another. Yeah, you can get it from Kinokuniya as well. This is weird. Okay. This is quite a good book. If you like you can get it from Kinokuniya, as I said. A good read. This lady, Sarah, she used to be the sort of first public policy officer of Facebook or Meta nowadays. She was the one who actually approached Mark Zuckerberg and told him that he would need to have some people to correspond with the government. And at the very beginning, Mark Zuckerberg sort of ignored, didn't buy the idea. but eventually he saw the necessity and recruit Sarah. And with those sort of conflict, whatever, this is one side, sorry, but again, you see some very, very interesting, like for example, in Sarah's word, she claimed that there is an algorithm that detect that whenever you post something on Facebook, if that message sort of says something that show that you are vulnerable, right? You are having trouble with lives, with your family, they're going to show you certain ads because they believe that in your vulnerable times, you are more likely to act recklessly or unreasonably. And this is more likely for you to convert. In other words, to buy things more easily when you're stressful. Right? And that is really bad, I mean, in terms of algorithm. Okay, so, and that is pretty much why it is very interesting about what these firms would do and how would it affect us. Okay, so I wouldn't. That is why I'm not surprised by the tactic that Meta used. I'm not talking about Meta per se. I would say that again, as I said, well, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. All right, and you see that these fines are just nothing to them. It's just probably a couple of days of income with them gone. Right, 500 million euro is nothing. Right, 200 million euros is nothing for them. Right, so these companies that might get capital trillions. These fines are just minor costs of doing business. They are willing to pay for these fines and keep doing their business the way they are. That's the way it is, and that's sort of happening. And that's why a lot of people say that, look, you can't just impose fines, but you have to impose this kind of remedy. And the remedy that's most effective is structural, not just a behavioral. All right, so that is kind of enforcement as a battleground of the DMA credibility. Okay, any questions so far? We're going to move to the next one. I hope you see the better picture of how digital platform could be problematic. Okay, good. I don't think we need a break here because we did already. So let's talk about a second motor. All right, we go into I want to go into this sort of big picture very quickly about what is going on here. Again, the term sponsor effects, right, means that whatever happened in the EU, in this case is the DMA, right, in terms of regulation, because of the size of the market, it has 450 million users, and most sort of regulated or undertakings, well, they would prefer to have one standard for all most of the times. And that is why EU regulations in the past has become what we call de facto global standards. All right. The question is like, in Southeast Asia, including Thailand, we see this sort of empirically a huge divergence. There's a debate between these two schools, right? The market correction and market creation. In other words, would we pro innovation? Should we actually protect it? If you look at Thailand, as I said, we got this thing on hold already, but we have had this sort of draft of Digital Platform Economy Act, or PEA. And I think Thailand is pretty much a prime example of this tension, right? It has been developing its own ex-ante rules, with public hearing held as recently as January and February 2025. Right? The DAO PEA state objectives are kind of familiar, right? The sort of terms that we have seen. It's trying to protect the public interest. It encourages fair competition. It sort of protects service users. But however, analysis of the draft, such as from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, right, it's kind of like, if you look at it, there's so many reports that if you look at the text of it, I really encourage you to have a look at the text yourself. It's kind of like the blend elements of the DMA and another law, which is the Digital Service Act, which is serving a completely different purposes, and that Digital Service Act is about content moderation and consumer protection. This kind of mixed bag approach, if you like, create uncertainty a lot. I think the most important critique is on the suitability of it. Again, this kind of, as I said, the benefit is still not really materialized, but the cost is there. And most of the benefit of this kind of ex-ante regulation would create is kind of a long-term benefit in terms of the economics dynamic, right? And you can see that some people would say that importing this of EU model is ill-suited for Thailand's unique economic and digital ecosystem. And I sort of argue that the DMA service still in its sort of, you look even to the places you copy it from, it's still very experimental. And it's even untasted, right? I mean, in the EU. So that is why, because of all of these, is sort of, put on hold. And I even say that, look, we do have this sort of royal decree of the digital platform service, which is, again, that is kind of like a smaller version of Digital Services Act already. And again, there's still no kind of like empirical evidence of the effectiveness of it yet in place. So that is why it's got on hold. Well, and they also say that, well, look, EU DMA is kind of market correction too. And you have to believe that the digital market are already matured and have failed, right? I mean, market failure is there, and then you require correction. But when you look back into the region, you see the word, you see why we talk about market correction and market creation now, right? Market correction say like, okay, there's a failure in the market and you need to correct it. Like you have that big player, but they talk about ASEAN in these developing parts of the world, that we are not having that kind of market that is mature yet. Everything is still developing. We are creating markets. And if you apply this sort of regulation to tame this sort of giant to an ecosystem of growing enterprises, that will risk stifling innovation. Right? So again, you remember the trilemma that I mentioned earlier, and it is pretty much there. And the question is like, okay, what do we do? What do we do? Seems like the DMA won't be here soon. Thai is still uncertain, right? But if you look in some sort of bigger picture, one thing that has just arrived at the conclusion very early is the ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, or DEFA. For those of you who will pursue this international, sort of oriented field, this is very interesting. This thing is actually pitched as the world's first region-wide digital economic agreement. Right? It sort of says something along like, should we within ASEAN harmonize our digital trade rules? Should we enable trust cross-border data flows, which is very important? We might need certain kind of rules to kind of harmonize our sort of e-commerce, digital payment, or cybersecurity requirements, and this kind of skills and talent mobility. All right. You can see that there is no priority for what we call the prescriptive ex-ante competition rules, right? It is more trade facilitation. So again, in ASEAN, we don't really talk much about it either, right? Because this is the nature of competition. And I think you sort of see this sort of clear. I won't go into every single cell, but you see clear contrast, right, between European Union and Thailand in terms of like how you basically deal with all these ex-ante regulations, and we seem to be sort of in a wait and see, Okay, so that is the situation of digital markets. But now, I mean, we haven't even done with the digital platform, but you can think about digital platform as like AI, like a prelude or this is a teaser, right? The teaser of the AI, which will come in full blown soon. It will not just go into some certain things that we need platform, right? It will basically go into most of these services that we're going to deal with, or even manufacturing industries, right? Legal consult, accounting consult. That's something that AI would go into, because so far the AI has come into this sort of recommendation system in this sort of marketplace, right? And this sort of like streaming. But now it would go directly to your doorsteps, right? So let's sort of pivot from platforms of today to the infrastructure. It's not just a platform, it will become the infrastructure, which is artificial intelligence, okay? So I think the first mistake that people usually make is to analyze AI as a single market. You have to think about AI, okay? Not a single market. It's not the market of AI itself, but you have to think about it as the stack. All right, a stack. What does it mean by stack? Stack, it means that you have a layer of different services that, well, you think about electricity, right? You have this sort of power plant, you have all these electricity wires and all these distributor players. They have a stack, right? You think about it as a supply chain. The AI has its own stacks as well. You think about at least 3 layers. The first one is the hardware and compute. You think about the chips, right? The GPUs, the cloud infrastructure, like AWS, Microsoft, Azure, right? And all these players in the infrastructure. The second is what we call the foundation model layer. This is actually relatively new, right? We talked about this large general purpose models like GPT-4, Gemini, or the open source one like Llama of Meta, of course. And the third is the application layer, right? The third is the application layer, which is the end user tools like ChatGPT, right? And AI legal assistant, which we have been using. In the legal field, we see Westlaw, we see LexisNexis, we see the uprising startup like Harvey. All right. So I think we've seen a lot of these players in many different industries. So when you understand this, what is very important is you have to understand that the competition is stack specific. All right, you have hardware layer, you have foundation model layer, and you have application layer. The stack concept is it's kind of like showing us two opposing forces. All right. If you look at the application layer, it's sort of wildly competitive. You see that there's an explosion of startups building tools, right? As I said, in legal tech, in account tech, in martech, in most different kinds of services now. Many using this open source model, and that is sort of, now we've seen a lot more choices. So that is in the application layer, right? It's kind of, as I said, two opposing forces. But when you think about the foundation model layer, it's super hyper concentrating. It's super concentrated, right? It's super concentrated. Why? Because of the new formidable barrier to entry, which is what we call the essential inputs, right? Compute, data, and talent. And that is, well, you need the energy abruptly, well, 100 million watt, if not billion watt, in order to train the model. And that is pretty much the whole state in the United States of America using electricity for a month. And if you're going to have a company that would have that capacity to even just to pay for the energy, well, let alone the cost of the infrastructure, like the GPUs that they have to buy, you don't have that many players who can actually afford to do that. And that is why it's so concentrated. And now you see the models that are competing. You have ChatGPT, which now they are trying to fight as hard as they can against some of the big players like Gemini of Google, right? Or, well, another one is the Claude of Anthropic. Another player, which is kind of like a dark horse here in this game, is Grok, right? Grok of XAI, which is essentially a company of Elon Musk, right? So you've seen just a couple players, right? And I think this sort of show a lot why you have a lot of barrier, right? You have a lot of barriers of entry. If you look at these just 3 barriers that I mentioned earlier, right? You can see that, well, in terms of compute, this is a very kind of huge barrier, and it's kind of new as well. Because if you're going to train what we call frontier models, this sort of new model like GPT-4, GPT-5, you require huge computational power, right? And this creates a barriers to entry. So let's look at some of the models you are familiar with. Just GPT-4, which is a previous model of OpenAI, right? The ChatGPT. The cost of training is estimated to be roughly $100 million. Right? GPT-4, $100 million just to train the model. And the Gemini, the previous one, you use roughly like $200 million for training, right? And of course, for the 2.5, is relatively much more expensive. And that is a huge amount of money. Right? We talk about, well, if you look at the corporate size here, it's very difficult for any company here to actually spend amount of money to just to train the model, let alone buying all this sort of processing unit. And the data, the frontier model would require vast and high quality data sets for training as well. And as you know, like these sort of incumbents like Google, Microsoft, or Meta, they have this sort of access to, well, troves of user data in which we can't imagine that the smaller players would have that opportunity. Right? And well, you learn intellectual property, and you know that another constraint for them is now it is more and more difficult for you to scrap the data for the website. But probably there's no use in that because most of the data in the internet has been used already for these players to really train. All right. But again, it might be that we are getting into the era in which the very high quality data, very domain specific data, now will become more and more valuable. Right? And even if you are smaller, you can actually get to high quality data, like the judgment of the Court of Justice of Thailand. That data is like gold, but no one has ever got a chance to access to that. The first one who get a chance to access to that going to be able to develop the legal tech that has this sort of proprietary edge over other competitors, even the big firms, of course. And the last thing is talent, right? I think it's probably for me the most important thing in this era. And that is why if you look at some of the attempts like Meta, Meta paid this kind of onboarding bonus. You don't have to do anything, you just join my company, to these top engineers that they try to attract from other companies like OpenAI or Anthropic or even Google, they actually offer up to $100 million for the signing fee, let alone the huge amount of salary or even shares benefit that they get. And that is sort of tell us why talent is super variable, right, in this game. All right, and this whole thing sort of leads to, well, what we see today, that we just see a small set of firms. All right, we just see a small set of firms: OpenAI, Google, Meta, Anthropic, who are dominating this frontier development. But if I have to put my bet, I think I'm going to put my bet on Google, because they are pretty much the only one who have the full stack, right? They have the infrastructure, all the computational power, all the energy even, right? And they also have this sort of, well, the layer of applications, right? And they also have the layers of foundation model, which is so strong. So they have pretty much all the layers on the stack. And I think that is their edge, which eventually other players would be outcompeted. And that is why, that again, competitive concern, right? Now when they can go into any market, as we discussed in our law and AI, right? It's going to be very difficult for other players to flex their muscle against these sort of big firms, especially in more traditional industries like law firms or accounting firms. It's going to be impossible. All right, and this sort of creates our next and perhaps most important observation. We are witnessing the creation of new and deeply concerning form of vertical integration. You are familiar with this term, right? You see that the firm that control the essential input, the cloud compute, are the very same firms that are building, funding, and controlling the downstream models. You think about it like this, right? Frontier model requires massive compute. And this compute is an input controlled by just a handful of cloud service providers, right? Cloud providers here. Just a handful of them, right? You think about Microsoft, right? Azure, right? Google Cloud, Amazon AWS, and that's pretty much almost 100% of the cloud service provider in the world. But these cloud service providers are also the same firms building their own foundation models, right? Like Google Gemini, right? And are the primary investors in other major model developer, because Microsoft is a big investor, if not the biggest. Actually, they are the biggest in OpenAI. And Amazon and Google are both major investor in Anthropic. You see this picture, right? You see this picture of vertical integration directly and indirectly. And this sort of creates a profound dependency. And an OI model startup cannot exist without a partner. That's also, again, its biggest competitor. And this is everything but level playing field, right? It is some people quite like this is a walled garden where the cloud providers are the new gatekeepers. And this creates a classic risk of anti-competitive foreclosure, right? We learned that, vertical foreclosure. And this is quite a problem. So let's talk a little bit about AI here, all right, just very briefly. If you look at Thailand, it's sort of pursuing two tracks simultaneously. We've seen this sort of national AI strategy, so many attempts at different levels. It's sort of trying to, well, they have some index, like there's this thing called Government AI Readiness Index, which is conducted annual basis. They aim that we're going to be at the top 50. They would like to create a certain value of economic impact, roughly 50 billion baht, which is, you look at the scale in the world, that's still nothing. They would like to develop more AI talents, and in target was roughly like 30 or 40,000 of the top talents in AI. So that is kind of on the growth side, right? But at the same time, we also have this sort of draft AI law, which is kind of adopting the risk-based approach. It has this kind of like prohibited risk AI and high risk AI, which we learn in the AI in the law class, right? But what it does is it's gonna be a bit more relaxing, more growth and innovation friendly, and they sort of actually the act was there in order to establish what they call the regulatory sandbox and innovation center, which is in the promotional side. All right. So again, Thailand is kind of example of any other jurisdictions that they need to balance this kind of like, well, guardrails versus growth agenda, right? So that's pretty much the picture of the case at the moment. Okay, I want to close this lecture with this sort of exhibition, if you like, about the case of Microsoft and OpenAI, because we just mentioned about them right now. We're having this sort of new vertical integration, and we talked about a specific case so you see a bigger picture. All right, let's talk about Microsoft and OpenAI partnership. Microsoft was actually one of the most initial investors, or like probably even like the original investors of the OpenAI from the very beginning in 2015. It's kind of, well, a very complex, billion, even trillion-dollar relationship. Where if you see the Microsoft is pretty much the OpenAI largest investor. The Microsoft Azure is also its exclusive cloud provider and its primary partner for commercializing products as well. Right, you see the Microsoft Copilot, which is basically based on the sort of OpenAI engineers. So this relationship is the archetype of what we call the new vertical integration or dependency risk, as we just identified, right? And it sort of triggered, as you unsurprisingly can see, that it triggered investigations so many different jurisdictions, which I would like to summarize them. You see the picture here. In at least 3 jurisdictions, the UK, under the CMA, which is the Competition and Markets Authority, the US Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the European Commission, which is under the DG, or Director General of Competition. All right, so 3 jurisdictions, 3 key jurisdictions. Well, this is actually a selected example, but it's for you to see that there is actually an attempt to talk about merger control in the case of Microsoft and OpenAI. For CMA in the UK, they have opened since December 2023 a formal merger inquiry. And the core question in that particular case is that, is it a relevant merger situation under the Enterprise Act 2002? In other words, is that investment leads to the Microsoft in acquiring the control over OpenAI? The answer, which was given in March this year, is that no. Right? It's not considered as merger, it's just an investment. That's the case of the CMA. If you look at the US, all right, the inquiry would also open a bit later than the UK. It was open in January 2024. The question is like, do these partnerships risk distorting innovation and undermining fair competition or not? Which is like more direct, right? We still haven't seen any conclusion of that yet. And again, this has been almost 2 years, right? And that is kind of ongoing. But if you search the internet and you found any more updated information, please let me know. I would really love to hear from that. And the last thing is the EU. They do have inquiry open at the same time as in the US as well. And the question is like, well, would this be under the EU measure regulation? And it's still ongoing. As I put here, it's preliminarily concluded as no control, but still they are still under this sort of scrutiny. All right. So I think the most decisive action is so far come from the UK CMA to conclude that this kind of like partnership does not qualify as a merger. And the reasoning, if you look, it is published in April 2025. It's quite critical. The CMA was sort of legally bound to taste for a change of control, right? The key word here is a change of control. Right. The key word here is a change of control. And well, in this case, is the CMA concluded that Microsoft inference did not escalate from material inference to what we call de facto control. Therefore, the CMO had no jurisdiction in that investment. I think this sort of highlights a fundamental gap in the traditional legal toolkit, right? That is the traditional merger control, because the legal taste of the control is pretty much a very 20th century corporate acquisition. And if you think about a strategic design, strategic partnership of having this sort of stacked dependency, this is probably too lenient to say that there's no de facto control, right? And if you look at the U.S. FTC inquiry, it is quite insightful as well. The share back then, as Lena Kant stated concern is not control, but the tactic that sort of forecloses opportunity and the risk of distorting innovation. So the FTC is sort of looking at the economic effect of foreclosure, while the CMA was sort of hamstrung by a legal definition of control, right? You can see the contrast different here. So I think that is why the legal frameworks are really, really much scrutinized in order to make sure that they're really are capable of dealing with the sort of complex dependencies that we have discussed so far, right? Going back to this Microsoft, you see that, well, Microsoft can sort of vertically integrate OpenAI into its Azure, right? And Office products like Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint. And eventually this could harm rivals, right? Without ever having to have this kind of de facto control of like OpenAI's board. But you control it by pretty much, you harm competition already by having this kind of like vertical integration in this stack environment. All right, so that's what you see. I think what is quite interesting, I'm gonna skip some slides here, is that it's kind of a twist as well. It actually came from the OpenAI itself, because in September 2024, Bloomberg sort of reported that OpenAI officials had met with the European Commissions and raised anti-competitive concerns about Microsoft, right? This is a smoking gun. It is not a regulator theorizing harm. It is the investee in this case, which is the OpenAI, complaining to the EU that its chief partner, Microsoft, is already using his what we call entrenched position to create what we call platform lock-in, which is a situation I just described earlier. And that sort of validates what we call foreclosure concern, that this case actually brought to European Commission, right? But you remember that is actually a FTC's concern. And I think it sort of explained why the CMA is finding, right? Because if you look at the CMA's finding, they noted that OpenAI's decreasing reliance on Microsoft for compute as a reason not to intervene, right? But why is OpenAI sort of diversifying its compute? And that report by CMA suggests that it is actively trying to escape the very dependency it fears. In other words, yeah, I mean, Sam Altman is actually trying to go out of this dependency, because they know that eventually, if they rely or they are so dependent on these sort of big firms, they're going to struggle to compete against them eventually. All right, so I think if I remember correctly, there was in the news that they actually went to talk to this sort of Amazon as well, in order to create this kind of like competition in terms of the infrastructure. All right. So I want to conclude my lecture here. Well, don't want to go further because the other things are, as I said, if we have time, is on this sort of infrastructure. But I think what is quite interesting is I want to talk about is sort of, again, final synthesis. Okay, I think what we learned so far is we cover a lot of ideas. Now you understand that the platform, what the digital platform is, and why the platform power is kind of real, right? It's a direct and kind of predictable outcome of the economic structure which we learned. Now, when you go out there, you understand what it means by two-sided markets, network effect, or high switching costs, and that makes their power really, really prevalent. The second one is we sort of learn what it means by the ex-ante model, right? And now it has become a sort of benchmark, and we learned the DMA. But we also know that there is a bottleneck of the effectiveness of it, especially in terms of the enforcement. We've seen that so far since the very beginning of this enforcement, it has no fruit yet, and the fines are relatively smaller to see any kind of significant compliance. And we also zoom back to the ASEAN, and we see that, look, there's a balance between the market correction in terms of market failure and also the market creation in terms of innovation. That we in this ASEAN region, maybe we have to have different priority vis-a-vis countries in the EU. But actually, even in the EU, there were quite a lot of criticisms, like the report by Mario Sacchi, who is a former prime minister of Italy. He even said that, well, if you don't do anything with innovation, the European Union will be lacking behind other regions a lot. Okay, and then we move to this sort of more advanced technology, something that's knocking the door, which is artificial intelligence. And we see this sort of stack-specific concentration. We know that this kind of like application layer is super competitive, but a foundation model layer is super concentrated. And that would lead us to this kind of like vertical integration or dependency problem. We explore the case of Microsoft and OpenAI to see a very clear picture of the loophole of existing, well, tools that we have in hand to deal with this. And we can see that probably we need to deal with this quite a lot, right? And that is why this is something that's ongoing. And I really want to encourage you to really dig deeper and try to understand it better. We'll follow the news, look at what is going on, because there are news every day regarding this sort of battleground, if you like. Okay, so that's pretty much what I want to cover today. Is there any question or, well, observation or reflection you would like to share?